Hey, this is Complexity Medicine. Welcome to Gateways and Bridges, an improvised and interactive inquiry exploring health and wholeness through performative and exploratory frames and metaphors. I'm artist Andre McClure, and this is Dr. William Sutherland, your hosts.
Hello, gentlemen. McClure with his perfect timing. This minute I hit record, he's going crazy with camera repositioning. Well done, sir. Well done. Quality operation here. So we got the three of us. We've got Bill and Andy as per usual. And we have one of our favorite complexity medicine compadres and colleagues, Sean Park, coming at us from Hamilton, University of McMaster, design thinker, and that's our topic tonight. We're going to dig into the design of design and a little bit of design thinking. So welcome there, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. A real treat to be here. You two fellas know how to throw it down with the dialogue, so I expect. I don't know what to expect. Is what I expect.
That's our status quo.
That's your motto.
Yeah. Could you put that in Latin for us?
Expectedly unexpected.
Unexpected.
But don't expect that.
But please don't expect that. Because we don't need the pressure. We don't need the pressure. It's a lot for sure, Andy and I. We're all about loopholes. And loopy holes, as the case may be. So I'll I'll punt the ball here and give us a start. So, a couple things. I mean, one of the notions I was thinking as we were coming into this conversation was, as we redesigned and rethought out this whole complexity medicine project, you're looking for the metaphors to convey to the public. What is it that you guys are offering? What are you doing? What are you talking about? And, marketing is rarely my strong suit, and branding is rarely my strong suit. And the quick elevator pitch is not something I've ever been good at. And so as I struggled for metaphors, one of the metaphors in the complexity medicine project or process was the notion of design thinking and health design, and that in some ways this was a design project. And it's pretty clear that it was a design at multiple levels. It had a fractal nature to it. So the idea that somehow whatever this design process that we were heading to had to take into account the individual, the society, and the ecology, our ontogeny, our histories, our evolutions, that it had to be aligned and congruent with those three things. And I went in with the idea that the principles and patterns of design that we were talking about would in some way hold true for all of these levels. And that was a litmus test to say whether they were true or not. But the other thing I'm quite proud of, and this may seem completely counterintuitive to anyone listening, is that by design, we have made a point to not define up front what design is in this process. Because to us, the whole complexity medicine process, in whatever it will be, in all the conversations we'll have, including today's and the many more with all the other people that will come in time, that we will co-define and design what we mean by this thing called design. And that rather than a front-loaded proposition, it is a back-ended discovery. And that rather than being a point, it is a process that we're trying to get to. And so that's sort of the starting point of where we are. So we really are, in a very authentic way, coming in with our not knowing. We're coming in saying this thing called design and holding it as a question. What is it? What is it to design? What is a design? Why use this word? How is design different than other words in the creative realm that we may go to? So that's one shot over the bow to begin with. The other one too is I just want to read a definition of design thinking, because somehow there's a distinction between design thinking and design proper. And I think that's a useful distinction for us to explore. But I wanted to throw out, and this was common of many ones, and this is off one particular website. What is this website that I'm looking at? I don't have my glasses on. And
that's a design challenge right there.
Yeah, so there we go. A design
Just
challenge.
make it up.
Can't tell you the site, but anyway, whatever this is. So I apologize in advance for what I'm going to read off of their site. But like I said, it is emblematic of what's out there.
Yeah.
So they write, design thinking is not an exclusive property of designers. All great innovators in literature, art, music, science, engineering, and business have practiced it. So why call it design thinking? What's special about design thinking is that designers' work processes can help us systematically extract, teach, learn, and apply these human-centered techniques to solve problems in a creative and innovative way in our designs, in our business, in our countries, in our lives. Okay. So I actually have some things about that I do quite like. And some things in that I find right away, actually, and I'm going to use the word here civilly, that I find offensive. So, for example, the notion of an unfettered or unchecked human-centeredness. Now, I think I tend ultimately towards something that's paradoxical, but let me go to the other side. So all of us have had a chance to explore, to one degree or another, traditional and indigenous ceremonies with our teachers and mentors that we've had in the world. And, so one of the things that, for example, with the Ojibwe tradition and our, for, over the last 20 to 30 years that we've got to partake in this cultural tradition, and many Native traditions will have this phrase, all my relations. And so it's said throughout ceremony, it's the punctuation that we get many, many times, this notion called all my relations. And so what would just to start, what would an all my relations centered design look like versus a human centered design? And then I recognize there's a paradox because we have our human perspective, and we're always going to come from that center. But how do we hold this notion of a broader relational center that we're part of, but not exclusive from? The other one, of course, is the classic problem solution, right? We have this dualism, this dichotomy. You've got a problem, we need to solve it, right? And I know that gets reversed, and you get problem centered, then you go to solution centered, but that just seems to be flipping to the other side of the coin. And then even the notion of just, that the breaking down of human life right into its parcels, that somehow medicine is different from architecture, is different from business, is different from, we have a global design for all these parts rather than a global design for a global experience called our human living in a contextual, living world that holds us. Anyway, those are a few ones off the top. And maybe I'm just going to throw the ball to Andy because Andy is coming in from, obviously, as our artist in residence, from the perspective of notions as art being separate from design. But Andy, just in terms of where we want to try to take this notion of design thinking and give something for Sean to run with here. Just before we go on, I'm just having some headphone things. Are you guys hearing me clearly throughout, or am I breaking up at all in as we've been talking?
I get the odd little bit of fade out, and then you're back in.
Okay, but otherwise it's there's still clarity. Okay, good. We will run with that.
I'm just visualizing that you're moving farther away from the mic and then coming back again in a gentle rhythm, moving back and forth.
Yeah.
It's probably true, which is probably bad podcasting form, but good biology. So we will, again, a design issue, bad podcasting form and good biology. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, but I'll just sort of come in a little bit on Bill's question and then let you run for a bit, Sean. We often have a distinction distinction between design and creative process, something we call the creative process, which is essentially, taking problems and working through a variety of stages that involve at some point, a critical analysis, that actually looking at where the process has taken us, and then just putting it back in again into that sort of cycle of research and study and prep and all of that, until some product has emerged from the creative process. And we sometimes think of design as sort of like the end result, like we're designing something. And so often the term design gets associated with control, that, essentially that I can adapt a creative process so that I have better control over the end product. And often, specifically in the context of school, everything is fairly, as much as we sort of present it as being non-linear, we give assignments and projects, and those are linear based, and we want an outcome that we can assess. And built into the system isn't the flexibility for, divergent kind of happenings, breakdowns in the process, because we're sort of focused on the end product design and what that looks like. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, ways around that, or ways to think about that notion of design that isn't based upon end results and based upon typical methods of control.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot of runway, there to work with. So let me start back with Bill. And I was actually, the definition that you provided is actually, there's a bit more integrity to that one than other ones that I've seen. And at the same time, the way that you kind of described your beefs with it gave me a sense about design as it's here in the conversation, as what we begin with really is about. I mean, we've talked about this in many other conversations before. To begin with our primary distinctions, right? What's the opening line to your prayer? What's the way that you first move your pen on the page? Is essentially your creation story, or some kind of beginning, which came after something else, and maybe it's not even really a beginning. And so we find ourselves really in the middle. Middle of what? Well, if I can think about the past few minutes that have been happening here, and if I could track my own experience and attention here, was really, one around, okay, so why am I here? Am I here to sort of speak something that I already know, or am I listening for something? Which now means, okay, so the senses, right? Observation. I hear the tenor of your voice, the laughter. I hear these words. And so you might ask, well, what's the signal and what's the noise in all of this? Right? Because I'm kind of thinking, well, what fits with what I know and what I can talk about, and what's outside of that? So within that, the first thing that really struck me was speaking about all our relations, and that is really, I think we can't. Don't think we can really talk about design if we don't have that as the first thing that we talk about. And it's like it's hard because the word design, I mean, like we made that up, and we could easily use all we can invent. I don't know, what do I see the word studio on your hat there? What do we call it? Right?
Open studio.
Open studio. Right? Design is, it can be an open studio. In that, and I guess here's where I start to kind of go with this is about, in all of our relations, there's creative action and destruction. This is like life. Life has to feed on life in order for the wheel to keep turning around. Right? And so we throw in the word change, and I'm just kind of layering some stuff in here. So to design, right? I think, Andy, you kind of talked about the noun, the thing, being contrasted with design being the process, the verb. And I guess we need to be careful that we don't get stuck on either side of that equation, and perhaps bring in some of the wisdom from Norbert. Well, I guess this might be Francisco Varela, that in our cutting up of the world, things aren't just dualities, right? Either ors, nor are they just unities. Ones that they're not one, not two, right? So that we need to be careful that we think we know what design is, but to appreciate that, yeah, sometimes there's stuff that we make that's actually part of this, and we can't ignore that. And so on that side, we've been making shit for a long time as a, you could say an intentional act as part of our very existence and survival. The houses we live in, right? That fork that put that food in your mouth. It's all been made, right, to serve some end, right? So there's that like piece, I think, that folks who are interested in formally studying design look at as like the making of things, right? The very sort of substance of like how we get food to the table, right? And that's concrete stuff, right? That's not just that's not abstract per se, like or solely abstract, right? Like it's stuff that we can feel, right? Like that pattern on that thing behind your the blanket on your chair, right? Like I'm kind of captivated by those diamonds, right? And by those lines, and I wonder about the texture of that fabric, and that somebody made that, and that might keep you warm, probably keeps you warm, right? So here's the thing. Making that thing involves somebody's labor, involved probably a machine, involved thread made from some kind of plant that came from somewhere on the planet. And so we can just talk about the ecology of that blanket right now, right? And kind of ask like, so what's the story of the thing? And we can unravel that, right? We can unravel that and ask all kinds of things about, is that if we take the view of it human-centered, then it might be solely located on, well, my needs, my wants, my pains, my hopes, my dreams, right? Maybe I want a blanket that's pretty cheap. I don't want to spend a lot of money, right? I want it quick. I want prime delivery tomorrow. Right? Hey, that's there's a human-centered justification there. So it's running away on us here because we haven't put life-centered as the basis for the design of the thing. Because if we did, I'm not saying you wouldn't have that blanket, friend, right? And maybe, I don't know, maybe you went like to Chile in the mountains and like you got it from
Actually, do you want to hear the story?
You should give me the story of that blanket.
All right. So I'm doing a workshop in Philadelphia, and my uncle is sick with cancer. I've been told he's only got about 5 weeks to live. He's very sick, and I'm down there, and I asked for support for the people at the group, and we had a blanket there, and so everyone came around and held onto the blanket and said a beautiful prayer for my uncle's health and well-being. And we ended up mailing that blanket to him. He's doing great. That was 6-7 years ago. He's doing very well. And one of the ladies who was there on that day sent me this blanket with a stone in it wrapped around. And that stone sits now on the top of my hill looking down over the pond, and in the summer it catches the sunlight really beautiful. So when I look out the window, I see that stone sitting out there. And I don't think she thought about the design of putting a rock wrapped around this blanket, and maybe the relationship between the cancer he had, but the synchronicity of those things and the unplanned design of that was quite beautiful. And so for you to see it tonight, and to see it and to be fascinated by its pattern, and for me to tell you the story now is quite beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I'm there on the hill, and I'm with, you use the word cancer, and hey, I'm living into that one right now, and so the blanket, it's like it's got all that care and that love there with it, right?
Yeah.
And now with us.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's how these things are given as gifts. Like it's not trivial, right? Like it's just, we're pumping out stuff. Like this stuff plays a role in our living. And I guess in a way, kind of like it feeds it or holds it or wraps it. Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in there for a sec? Just because I have a suspicion that there's going to be so many things that we're going to miss the harvest. But Sean, let me just put this back to you and tell me how you think this feels from your perspective as we look to. I dare not even say definition, because I'm not even looking for a definition, but qualities, characteristics, signposts that put us in the right direction.
Yeah. So
I've heard first off that, there's something in the making of things that both meets our needs. The making and the receiving. Like
mm-hmm.
you mentioned, like prime, like how fast it comes, the making and the receiving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there's always cost. There's always cost and externalities to what is ever made and received. There was the notion in Andy's story about the importance of story, that somewhere in the design definition that we're looking to understand over time, there needs to be an essential role to story. That a thing given should also, it sounds like, be given with a story. Not just an object of of need, but an object of need that is also carries a narration, a story, a joke, something that also connects further than just its objective qualities. So something about the story and stories.
And that's the aesthetic. That's the aesthetic.
Okay. Yeah. So now to the, yes. And there's something, and of course, I guess the aesthetics can be the story that it gives itself. I mean, the blanket itself carries a certain type of beauty. But when something is then layered with that, there's something there. So the importance of story in there strikes me as important. Anyway, those are just the ones that have come, in our conversation so far.
Yeah. I mean, the other piece here is also like part of story is also meaning, right? Like story doesn't just exist out there, right? That it's, the sea of dots gets connected by us, the making of the lines that connect those dots, which becomes part of now how the world is seen, right, in all of its changing forms, and becomes a way to, I mean, yeah, we know, like, if you probably know Viktor Frankl, right, and logos and meaning as, if we have a reason to live, I mean, we can handle many or almost any how. So this, like this, the story or the meaning being, I don't know, like the way in which life can be, the way in which life circulates and can be communicated.
Mm.
And that, I think, is like something that is always ongoing. So maybe like an example, I'm thinking about Bill coming into my design class to ask the question, what is health? And everybody was asked to bring in an object as a starting point for a conversation about that. Bill brought in a tissue, which, I mean, it's kind of seems sort of mundane or trivial, right? Something you wipe your ass with, I think Bill said. And the class laughed because here was a guest using curse words, which is quite nice. But opened up to a beautiful story about Bill being a child and being on a bicycle going down a hill really fast. And like any kid who doesn't necessarily think about the risk of what might be at the end of the road, I think, Bill, you said you crashed hard. You skidded hard with a rash. And excuse me in the telling of the story as I heard it, because it's as I heard it, was a guy came up to you and you were bleeding down the side and he offered you a tissue, but otherwise was pretty kind of frozen in terms of what to do, how to help you. And you ran back up the hill to Mom, and Mom was there, and it was Mom who was there to hold you and be with you. And I mean, like, I don't know how many years ago that was. I don't even know if I got the details right there, but that's as I remember it, Bill. Am I more or less on the right track with how that went?
Well, that's it. It's lovely to hear it retold back. So
yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah.
Yeah. And that story, I mean, it's stuck with me, and I don't know how many of them it's stuck with, but it stuck with me. Because it wasn't even really about the tissue so much, right? Like but it held a place in that story that became a vehicle. You brought the tissue in, right? And it's something that, I mean, it's a metaphor. It's something people could relate to because they've also had tissues in other ways, in other senses. So yeah, Bill, I mean, just to kind of build on that, like, yeah, the story is here, is there with the thing, and how it's made and how it participates in our life.
I remember teaching in film studies class how there's only a few basic storylines. You know, there's a few plots, and they're not really, you know, there's not that many. But from those simple plots, we add in different characters and different settings and you know, different actions, and from those all the other stories sort of emerge. And I almost think, you know, stories are a bit like DNA. You know, you break down DNA, and it's not that complex. It's not that, you know, it's there's not this huge amount of difference at its smallest base, and yet from its unfolding produces all of these stories, these living stories, life on our planet. there's something quite, you know, I kind of think about those basic building blocks as kind of like our basic story. You know, we're just, you know, the characters moving in and out of these variations.
And I mean, this is part of, I guess, if like I can connect it to what goes on in the world of design thinking, as it's being, I guess, practiced and espoused out there, is really one of beginning with storytelling through not trying to solve a problem, but to really generate and listen to stories that people have in particular contexts, right? And so sometimes it's like somebody in, you know, for some of my students, it's people in their own community. Right now, students are working with first-year university students who they're not having an in-person university experience. They're sitting at home with 5 courses a day's work and navigating that. And there's a toll. There's a challenge in that. And so the I guess the part one is like the empty bag of the doctor, or in like coming in without the definition. It's like, okay, so let's begin with telling some stories about like what's going on in our life. And I guess like the word that's used is empathy, but it's obviously more than that. I mean, it's a starting point for people for my students to say, well, we don't have to look at the world like through the lens of a discipline, which comes back to be your other point, Bill. Unless you want to kind of talk about story as a discipline.
Well, I do want to talk about story as a discipline, because I think, but story not as a discipline, like as in transdisciplinary or something like that, but as a discipline practice.
Yeah.
And that practice has 2 parts. There's the telling of a story, which I think that part is the sense of telling it in a deeply relational and embodied way. You know, retelling the story as though you're there. Even when it's somebody else's story, Sean, like you told the story as though you were there. You know, like, you know, I felt it. You know, it was the right capturing. And then, like you said, with your students, I think this is essential. This is the discipline, right? Which is before we do any story manipulation, and we can talk about that in a second, before we use the story or utilize the story, that the discipline to receive and catch another story as they're asking you to catch it, like to just catch this living, wild creature called a story, that you may not know how to handle. You may not, it may be the wildest of stories. It might be difficult to catch without shutting down, without blocking, without projecting, without going somewhere. So the discipline of telling and receiving a story, I think, for any of us that strive to be designers in this way that you're defining, I think that that's the first core practice. And I think we're trying to exhibit and practice that with each other here, as well, right? Like, how do we catch, both give and catch these stories? And then once that's there and it's part of us, that we start to metabolize that into our being, then I think there's either a direction we can either go up or down. And Andy spoke to the one, which is like the DNA of stories I mentioned in media, right? And so we can go down in a reductionist way into what is fundamental or what are the parts of the story. And I think, maybe that is archetypes, these are the archetypes of things, or maybe they're mythological tropes or dualities of good and evil, these core aspects of mythologies that we see again and again throughout culture coming forth with a new form, but the same base. So we can go to that level. Or I think then the designer can go up a level. What is the story of these stories? What is the meta that catches and holds these? And you can find commonalities in either the up or the down. The commonalities of the DNA are the commonalities of the story such that they can belong to the same umbrella, the same meta. But before we go up or down in the design process and how this can be useful or universal or applied or whatever the kind of words you want to put to it, I still think the discipline is the telling and the catching and the retellings. I think retelling is really important in that discipline, just like you did. Can you tell the story back? We had this experience the other night in our line and design course where one of the participants told the story and Andy told it back into a full but different way such that he could hear it and catch his own story back differently. And that's iterative, right? And so there's this iterative discipline of catching, telling, catching, telling, catching, telling, catching. And at some point when that's dense and ripe and fermented and metabolized and all of these sort of biological things we do with stories, then do we go down, do we go up, or do we go both? And then understand how we move from there.
The discipline part's really fascinating from the perspective of, you might call it design ethnography, as a part of this conversation where you don't just go up to somebody and say, hey, tell me a story, but that you might give somebody a piece of paper and say, draw me a map of your day, right? And so the story can take many different forms, in that you might ask people to say something, but you might also invite people to do something or make something, which generates its own kind of story. Just like that painting behind you that was a making of you and Andy in a dance and a dialogue of, well, it doesn't even, from what I remember in you speaking about that painting, Bill, that you and Andy didn't even really exchange words in that, that you would make a stroke and then, well, Andy would come over it something and then it would disappear and you'd have your own feeling and you move on in that. And so there being the sharing and receiving of a story beyond the verbal, right? That it is also an embodied act, right? Of making. Have I lost the connection here? Are we still on?
Still on.
Okay. Bill froze.
Oh, sorry. Yep. You're good. We're good.
He does that. He does that sometimes. He actually just does it to freak you out.
I'm an aspiring mime as we're here. I didn't really freeze, but I just gave that impression.
So, I mean, the use of images, for example, I get some of my students to make cards with images on them, and then they become part of a conversation where people use images as a way of communicating story, because the image is able to be a symbol, a placeholder, a vehicle, a prompter, a generator of things that may not otherwise think about if it was just asking them a question. So there's, I think, something about the discipline of stories and storytelling that makes full use of our range of senses. You ask, I mean, I took my students out for a walk around campus, and I was, what's this? L. Murray Schafer, the Canadian composer, talked about soundscapes, and that you basically have a composition that's unique every time, where you mark a point in time where it's the beginning, and then you go for a walk and you listen, and that listening is the score, and then there's an end, right? And so the story in that sense is marked by a frame, and I think this is really critical, right? We need to I think, talk about frame and story, because as Frank Zappa's got a great piece on creativity. He says, without the frame, he asks, otherwise, what's that shit on the wall? Right. To John Cage, the composer, who put a little microphone on his throat as he gurgled orange juice. Right. The act of gurgling orange juice is like whatever, but putting the microphone on now was the frame, that this was something significant, and it had some boundary or border, had a marking. So I guess it's, what are the markings that are part of the discipline of story and how we tell and receive story?
Could we say that feelings are frames?
Say more. I don't know. It's a great question. What do you? What's your sense?
As Bill was talking, I was sort of thinking, like, one of our mentors, Brad Keeney, would say, you're trying to catch a feeling, right? And as Bill was talking about receiving a story and retelling a story, one of the most beautiful things about all of that is makes you feel, like how a story makes you feel. But also there's something about either receiving a story or telling a story or composing a story in some way that when it happens, the people who are participating, their feelings change. Like there is whether you want to think of it as an empty frame or a existing frame or something, there's a kind of pattern that we receive, that we recognize that this is moment, like there is something ripe here, something juicy, as Bill was saying, there's some fruit that is about to be received here, and we can feel it as sadness or tension or something. But just now hearing you talk, I could hear the change of the excitement in your voice, and as we began, I could feel sort of tension in your voice and heaviness, and as those feelings shift, the words shift, the frame shifts.
Mm-hmm.
With that, I think in some ways it's an interesting thing. So we'll go with Andy's question, like, is the feeling the frame? And my suspicion is that it's not, but I like the beginning of it. I think a feeling is an internal truth, right? When we feel something, we have this internal sensational, coupled with our emotional and mental reaction, to the world and however it's coming. But we're not solitary. So how do we convey this real truth that is happening, this feeling that is happening, that either needs to be digested or expressed or shared or suppressed or whatever the case may be? And then, Andy, you went on to talk about the other things that you were mentioning about, like, Sean's expression, the tone of his voice, the way things have been changing. You see, I think that those vectors those are framings, I think, right? Those ways that we can vector this energetic internal sensation state experience that's would otherwise be just hideous, terrible isolation if we couldn't express it out into the world. We vector it through these various ways and tools, either, our own expressions, our body language, our tone, our prosody, or we pick up an instrument, or we express it through movement and dance. And then somehow in there, we come into something, and I don't even know what these words necessarily mean, but they feel right. Into first a resonance. We begin to resonate with each other. And then that organizes and becomes a greater self-organization that's new and emergent and coherent, right? We come into this broader coherence. And so I think that that's important. We start with this feeling and then it gets amplified, right? We find a different way into it. We find a way, like I said, to first resonate and then come coherent as we come into this broader whole. Yeah. I don't know. I throw that when you guys think about.
Last night, during bedtime with Theo, I just had this kind of urge to say, Theo, I'm gonna show you how to cook a prayer. At least as far as I understand what that is. And this is Brad's mentorship kind of coming through. And I said to him, we don't need to start at 100 degrees. You can't. We're always going to come in cold. Well, for the most part, come in cold. I wasn't really feeling much at that point. And they said, it's okay to start here. Right. Because he knows a little bit about when things get warm. And so I said, well, we just start with a couple of words, right? Communing with thee, right? Really just a bit cold, but that's, we were just heading in a direction. And then we started to kind of say it over and over again and work with feeling the resonance with our body and that kind of response with each other. And then just playing with it a little bit, right? Feeling like, where's the flexibility in this body, but not pushing it too much, right? Like we're not trying to like push to 100 here, right? But we gotta move. We have to act. We have to move our body, right? So communing with thee. And it's, like there became a point where it felt warm. And he wanted to push. I said, hey, like, let's just be okay with this. And then it cooled down. And it felt nice, but it was different than when it was warm. And then that was it. And he said, well, Dad, that's really cool. Like, he's really, because he's working with multiplication right now a lot. He's all about patterns, right? And he's like, Dad, like, there was like, 1, 2, 3. Right. There are these like steps to this and like it just blew his mind. And now he's like seeing 3s everywhere. And right. So it became, I think, coming back to like what you're talking about there, Andy, I'm curious like about the way in which the frame that we're in, the way it holds or generates, different kinds of feelings, right? For the transformation, transformation. I don't know. Geez, like, where the frame is me and him and our relationship to everybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's Theo, right?
Yeah.
And you started with commune with thee.
Communing with thee.
Thee, like THE.
THE. Yeah.
Yeah. I almost think like, as Bill was saying, these sort of vectors, you're telling that story, and I'm thinking about my own telling stories to my kids. And I'm also thinking about how when they were young, I could say, let's cook this story, you know, or let's shake this story. And they didn't need to know what I was asking or saying. Like, they didn't need an explanation at all. They just heard the way I said it, and they were on board. Like,
Yeah.
they were in.
Yeah.
And that idea that like, I almost think sort of, you know, in terms of design, like, the ultimate goal of my questions isn't, you know, to come to these answers, or the ultimate expression of my stuff isn't to like make more stuff, but it is to have feelings. It is to like to be deeply in these non non-place places. And so when you were just telling that story, I was thinking how much you didn't say to your son, and how much you were holding. You know, like, so you were being very soft and energetic, but also that place where he started to warm up. You know, maybe there was a little bit of, let's hold it there because dad needs to hold it there.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
that's a little farther, and dad's gonna, like, you know,
Yeah.
he's gonna be a dam. He's gonna burst. Stuff's gonna happen. But that idea of like sort of teasing out the edges of things, of being at the edge of the story, is just, it's beautiful.
I don't know if you could hear yourself in my story about Theo Bill.
So, how so, Sean? Oh, about back to my tissue again?
No,
No.
no. Like, let's hold here. I can remember, I mean, a couple of times around the fire with you, and that encouragement to, like, we don't have to push this anywhere, and it's come to aid, and I get to share that with my son now.
Yeah, I you know, if you think about our primordial being, you know, who we are as, who we were as primordial human beings. I mean, that campfire, that night fire, was an amazing place, right? Because it was both a definition of the known and the bounded, the well-framed, the circumference that the light would be casted from the fire. And it simultaneously provided tremendous space, because all of that darkness outside of that circle, you know, was the place of dreams, of creativity, of our shadows, of our next days, our potential lights, you know, and all of that, the creatures that were out there. And as you guys have been sharing stories today, I've been really struck by some important parts. And I think as we consider what this notion of design thinking is, that it's important, right? Does the stories that we're looking to tell have space, that things can grow bigger than whatever, you know, the singular thing is that comes out of the design? Is there space for this to grow and become something more? So is it spacious? You know, I think that's an important one. And again, you know, there's a sort of vernacular in design, right? Like the known knowns, the unknown knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. But, you know, I think we live in fear of the unknown unknowns, right? Like the black swans, these things that are, you know, could potentially come. But it seems to me that a good design process should invite the possibility of unknown all the time, that we should, again, that all of your stories, like that were shared, that, or many of the stories being shared here today, they weren't stories that answered everything. They actually, as much, were inviting and pointing to that which we not even dare speak of, but they're present. That's sort of if we want to call that the unknown or mystery or the unseen, that somehow that is being woven in to the story and ultimately into the design process and to what we design. And in this case, we are designing this conversation. We are, contributing to this project, whatever. But I like that there is this place for the space, the unknown, and like you said, also too, for transformation, using Brad Keeney's vernacular, the idea that these rooms can get big or these experiences can become heated, that there is a space for, that there's space for another phenomenology other than just the obvious. The Japanese had a great word for this. They would talk about omote, like everything you see in the front, like around clothing. And then they would talk about ura, like they'd open up the, like the kimono or something, and the backside where you see the stitches. Like there's always the obvious, and then there is this invite into that which you can't see and necessarily don't see easily, but it is part of the design. This omote ura, the front, the back, the seen, the unseen. I really like that that's in the conveyance from you guys today, and I'm very much appreciative of that, and some gratitude in that way too. So thank you.
I'd like to officially and formally acknowledge the third that's arrived. Hello. Hello to the present of presence. How sweet you are.
I love it. And it's one thing to say something, and it's one thing to become that which you'd say. You can say words like resonance and coherence, and then to find yourself cast into the stillness of that whole state. And like you said, find the presence that's broader. The other, the third, that's not the one, not the two, but that which is allowed to come forth. And surprisingly so, and differently so, and yet so reassuredly so, when you create the space for it. I'm sure whoever our listening audience is going to have to learn to live with these dynamic pauses in our podcasts and our telling. It's not a technical error. We're in presence. The present of presence is showing up. Yeah.
And there's the wisdom in it that's like, I remember the old Quaker thing, if, don't say anything, it's not going to add to the conversation. Like nothing wanted to spring forth. And it was just like, no one, like, don't talk. Like, you don't need to talk right now.
My mom me to a Quaker church when I was younger, and all that silence was just my attention deficit brain was and she just kept trying to like keep me quiet and down and silent, and I just wanted to move and talk, and I think about that, like, like when you're young, you want to make the story from every part of you. And I love the transition to like the sort of like comfortable adult storytelling, and that transition into elder storytelling, where there's little talking and less movement, and maybe you don't even understand the point of the story until you're at home, or a couple of days have passed, and you wonder why you were making cookies, or sitting on the floor, watching them do something, and why they told that little story, that didn't seem related or connected in some way, and that sort of kind of transmission of silence and patience, and and knowing that you don't need to rush it, that you can wait, you can hold it, and that it will show itself.
And just like Sean's gentle teaching to his son Theo, also that we don't need to rush head on to that ending too quickly either. I think about the time I did get to spend with the Bushmen in Namibia, and they tell an enthusiastic and kinetic and rambunctious story well into their late years before maturing into the more spacious story. And then lastly, the elder story. And I remember, working with these elders and, who were in their 60s and 70s. And they're like, oh, no, we're young women. We're young women. It's the old women that really have it, but we're young women still. And I would say, yeah, there's, to hold that beautiful thing, what you just said there, Andy, as well, I mean, we could hold it as a progression, but I think it's also a great tension, right? Like, that we can span in any given moment. Although back to discipline, I think what is true, and maybe this is the thing too, which is being able to create the space for the other stories to be told until such time that our space is created for us to tell ours. I think that discipline starts quite young, with the Bushmen, for example, and maybe that's maybe that in some ways is sort of the learning of modern people, right? Is that we will get a chance to tell our story with gusto when we get the chance to tell our story with gusto, but every moment isn't our chance. And maybe it's that one mouth, two ears kind of classic type of saying, right? But that being said, like, how do you hold in that time? It's actually not silent. It's participatory, right? When somebody else is sharing, we get to we get to feel it, and we get to move with it, and we get to laugh with it, and we get to cheer them on and egg them on, and, be struck by what they say, or be, hit into dumbness of, and silence. So it's not this like held nothing, right? That we are part of this, this shared orchestration. Yeah.
Marie and my wife and I were talking today, and she said, I think it would be better if we personalized COVID, and gave it kind of an identity, and then people could better relate to it, because they think of it as just kind of a nuisance that they have to deal with. And I said, Bill, maybe it might be better if actually we thought of it as a designer, and as we rather think that we're sort of shaping nature, that nature is this, constant designer, and that maybe COVID is this opportunity to redesign, and is with us to help us in our own physiology and our own culture and our own sociology and psychology and everything. And like, it's just it's, it's sometimes the design is just brought forth because design needs to occur as if things are to change.
I really like that.
If I can be so rude as to invoke a commonly parroted definition of design here that has some echoes of that, and that is Herbert Simon, who was kind of one of the big theorists in design, that design is the process of taking current situations and turning them into preferred ones. And so there's this notion of change that is very much about, right, like something sucks now and we need to move towards the better, right? Whatever that preference might be, right? For comfort, for life, right? So it's about the change, right, of the situation. And I think you're right that, but again, that's a framing, right? That here we are, here is an opportunity. Here's a situation that, because I guess as I look at it, that there are others who see the future as there's no hope and we can't do anything about it, right? Others are like, well, there's some hope, but I can't do much, right? Or, I meet a fair number of people in medicine who are like, yeah, you know what? There can be a better world and we're going to be the ones who change it. I mean, there's that like sometimes arrogance, right? That we're going to redesign this. We're going to fix this, right? We're going to tackle this. We got this. So yeah, I feel like there's a piece here about that attitude, the attitude towards future, right? Because I guess if we're going to talk about story, we can talk about past and present and future as perhaps sometimes useful distinctions. And I'm beginning to engage my students in thinking about future design. And I think, Bill, you mentioned this earlier about the capacity to generate options, if you will, to see that there are multiplicities, and that I think we can sometimes only think of the ones that are preferable because they exist within our current frame. But there's lots of plausible futures, right? That some of them involve humans, right? Some of them involve, I think about an indigenous artist our museum who has exhibited, whose work looks at visual landscapes. For example, the city of Toronto being rewilded, right? And imagine downtown Toronto and all its urbanicity being reclaimed by the wild, by the wilderness. And so to imagine and visualize that and make that concrete, to awaken our senses to that is so powerful, right? That maybe that doesn't exist now, but now that I have that in my mind, then what about rewilding the planet? David Attenborough's got a great documentary or whatever, where his main thing is like, well, biggest thing we can do is rewild this planet, right? And I was kind of like, shit. Say it, brother, right? There's a story, and that's not a human-centered story.
I like when you're talking about preferred outcomes, design being things are shitty. How can they be better, right? The preferred. But there's another part that I'm fascinated lately, which is I can't help but wonder if we've been deprived of deprivation, and that's part of the problem, right? Like when you don't need, if I don't have to worry about where my heat comes from or where I'm getting my meal, or and I understand there's people that go without it. I'm not trying to create a universal here, but in terms of averages in general, so most of us, that in many ways we don't have to think survival, right? Like we're not actively, consciously thinking, is this water going to kill us? Am I going to die of hypothermia tonight? Sure, there are people in the world, and that needs to be obviously addressed in this, but in a broad sense. And how in not having that, right? Like not having things of deprivation and survival, and that how often that may be in its own essence sort of the root of so much disease. And then, does depression live in a world where you have to actually think about getting fire, for tonight, and clean water, and thinking about your energy conservation and what animal or plant is going to feed you and your family? Like, so, it's interesting with design. I don't know if it's just about preference and feel good, but how do we design in deprivation? How do we design in challenge that is congruent with our evolution and our deep history? And these are fun things to think about, and probably more than the conversation tonight, but something to really consider in the broader process, that it's not all about feel good, and it maybe feel good isn't. It's like anything, too much of anything good is not good. Like what is the right tension or the balance? Yeah.
Whose preferences?
Just I'm just looking at the time, and probably just the name of things to wrap up and get us to bed. Just a couple of footnotes. I like, Sean, that you were talking about the notion of future design as one possible distinction, or which brings up notions of design of the immediate moment versus that which has been designed and what we learn from it. And I just want to lay down as a couple of footprints maybe for future conversations that are going to be far broader than this one, but also just footnotes so that we might come back to. I heard somebody mention the word ethical design. I'm like, oh, that's an interesting question. Like, what is ethical design? And then I heard somebody use the phrase ontological design. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. What's ontological design? And then it got me thinking, well, then what would be epistemological design? Multi-perspectival natures and other ways of knowing. And then I got thinking, like, what is for us with all that we do around our art? Like, what is an aesthetic design? Not in a small sense of designing for beauty in the surrounding, but designing the beautiful and the right and the deeply relational. And so to take these sort of different philosophical streams at some point and to better understand, well, the philosophical modes, ontology, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, but to understand them through design and understand design through them. I would love to have a conversation down any of these at some time, and maybe we consider that among other differences and distinctions, how we can again further understand this design monster that we're getting into here.
Yes, I'll add one additional footnote there, and then I'll say farewell here for the evening. Is the emerging field of transition design is come up. The Carnegie Mellon University has a very ecologically centered perspective on a world that doesn't even exist yet, that we need to think about, and so there's a mapping there that may be useful for that futures conversation. And I think at some point as well in this, I would not be afraid to utilize some of the tools and methods vis-a-vis a workshop. Might work a question in a way that prompts us to think about what are, if we might invent our own tools and methods that's unique to the work that we're doing. How would we do that? What would that look like if part of our work might be to create new structures, new services, new experiences, new ways of doing things? That would be also fun. So, guys, I really appreciate being here and having the felt presence as a real thing, and to share and receive stories. And I think we embodied the thinking part as well of the design thinking.
So Andy, I'd like to kick it back to our poet in resonance, Andy McClure. Andy, how do you want to wrap us up tonight? Like that blanket, like a rock. How are we? How do you want to bring us full circle?
You know, when Bill said that we were wrapping up, I'm going to tell you the first thing that came to my mind is that Sean, that you're holding a kind of teaching right now, a kind of tension, and I would be really honored if you just sent us out with a little bit of heat.
A little of that heat?
A little of that heat. Yeah. Just, the same thing you gave your son, a little of that would just, I would be very honored.
Mm-hmm. Dear Creator, thank you for this day. Thank you for this life, for the friendship here. Thank you for these feelings, for this joy, for the sadness. Creator, help us to be humble and grateful for all the gifts that we're getting every day, for the ones that you take away from us, from the ones that you give us. Help us to revel in this life. Just do it. Just do it, Lord. Amen.
Amen, brother.
Amen, brother. Thank you for that. Thanks for that sharing. All right.
Thanks, man.
I know this may sound odd to the rest of the world, but I love you guys. I love you, Sean. Love you, Andrew.
Love you.
And I love that we can gather in this way and express it with each other and share with each other and, find our way in through this crazy thing, called life and this wonderful gift. And I look forward to the next time we see each other. So with that, I'm going to hit the end of the recording and say goodnight. And